Today, we're going to look at one of the most powerful and, well, complex regions on the entire planet, that massive urban corridor stretching all the way from Boston down to Washington, D.C. But we're not just going to talk about cities and highways. Nope, we're going to look at it in a totally different way.
I want you to think about this for a second. What if we treated this huge, sprawling network of 50 million people not as a bunch of different places, but as a single living organism? You know, an organism with its own metabolism, its own circulatory system, and, yeah, its own pretty unique set of health problems.
Because let's be honest, that's the reality. BosWash really does function like one integrated system. The problem? It's governed like a patchwork quilt of dozens of separate jurisdictions. And that fundamental conflict, right there, between the physical reality and the political mess, is putting the entire system under some serious stress.
So here's how we're going to break it down in this explainer. First, we'll introduce a new way to see this region. We're calling it the infrastructure biome. Then, we'll diagnose the symptoms of its stress. After that, we'll do a deep dive into a really specific conflict around natural gas. And finally, we'll lay out a prescription for how we might govern this thing more holistically. Okay, so how do we actually start thinking of this region as a living thing? This first section is all about introducing a really powerful new framework for seeing BosWash not just as a place, but as a complete system.
The term we're using is infrastructure biome. So instead of seeing cities and states as these totally separate things, this concept asks us to see the entire corridor as one single ecosystem. Now, the species in this ecosystem aren't animals. There are massive infrastructure systems, the energy grids, the water networks, the transportation lines. And just like in nature, they are all deeply, deeply interdependent.
And this is where the analogy gets really useful. Think about it. The transportation networks, all those highways and rail lines, they're like the biome's circulatory system, just moving people and goods around. The energy grids, that's its metabolic system, burning fuel to create the power it needs to live. And from this point of view, a state line is just an arbitrary mark on a map. It's totally irrelevant to the actual health of the system. This really hammers home that crucial point of interdependence. A problem in one part can spread like an illness, and suddenly the entire organism is sick.
So, if BosWash is our patient, what are its symptoms? Let's take a look, because there are some clear and frankly alarming signs that this biome is suffering from some pretty serious chronic conditions.
And hey, this isn't some new diagnosis. Way back in 1961, the geographer Jean Gottman, who actually came up with the term megalopolis, pointed to this exact problem, the nearly impossible task of coordinating anything across this crazy web of jurisdictions. So we've known about the disease for over 60 years. Now we're really seeing the effects.
First symptom, the biome's arteries are old, really old. A lot of the critical rail infrastructure, the absolute spine of the corridor, is over a century old. We're talking about tunnels and bridges built for a completely different era, now trying to carry the lifeblood of a 21st century economy.
And when one of those old arteries fails, wow, the cost is just staggering. A single, unplanned one-day shutdown of the Northeast Rail Corridor, we're talking an economic hit of over $170 million. That's the price you pay for a system that's so tightly interconnected that one little failure can cause a massive economic heart attack.
And it's the exact same story for the energy system. Almost a third of the natural gas pipelines running right under our feet were put in the ground before 1970. That's before many of the modern safety regulations we rely on even existed.
So what this all adds up to is a serious, corridor-wide vulnerability. This toxic mix of aging infrastructure and fragmented management means a failure in a New Jersey tunnel or a pipeline in Pennsylvania isn't just a local problem. Oh no. It can trigger a cascade of disruptions that impacts the entire biome.
So, to really get a handle on this dysfunction, we need to basically perform a biopsy. We're going to zoom way in on one critical issue, the transition away from natural gas, to see how this lack of coordinated governance plays out in the real world in real time.
And this right here really illustrates the sheer scale of the challenge. The BosWash biome is an absolute powerhouse. It holds almost 20% of the U.S. population on just 2% of its landmass, and it consumes a massive 18% of the nation's natural gas. So this region is trying to lead on climate change while being incredibly dependent on fossil fuels. That's a tough spot to be in.
This creates a huge conflict.
At the local level, you've got cities like New York passing really ambitious laws to ban natural gas hookups in new buildings. But then you look at the state level and you see the exact opposite. Some states, like New Hampshire, have actually passed preemption laws that explicitly forbid cities from banning gas. In other places, like Massachusetts, a uniform state building code was used to strike down a town's attempt to do the same thing. It is a perfect recipe for total gridlock.
And look, this isn't just some abstract policy debate. This uncoordinated mess creates real social vulnerability. An analysis of natural gas leaks in Massachusetts found that they are not only more concentrated in marginalized environmental justice communities, but they also get repaired more slowly there. So the failure to govern the system as a whole creates these deep, deep inequities.
Now, what's so interesting about this slide is the total disconnect it shows. Take a look at Connecticut. They have an ambitious goal to cut greenhouse gas emissions 45% by 2030, but over 15% of their gas infrastructure is leak-prone. Virginia's aiming for net zero by 2045 with much newer pipes, which is good. But then there's Massachusetts, aiming for net zero by 2050, while a staggering 18% of its pipes are leak-prone. The states have these huge climate goals, but the physical reality of their aging infrastructure makes hitting those goals almost impossible without a coordinated regional plan.
Okay, so what's the prescription? How do we start treating the patient instead of just chasing its individual symptoms? Well, the solution has to be just as integrated as the problem is.
And here's the good news. We actually have models for this. The Eastern Transportation Coalition is a voluntary partnership of almost 200 agencies across 17 states and D.C. They work together on everything from traffic data to cutting emissions. It's proof that regional cross-jurisdictional management isn't some fantasy. It's already happening in the transportation world.
So, building on that success, here is a clear 4-step prescription. 1. Get smart about repairs. Focus on replacing only the most hazardous pipes to maximize safety and avoid sinking money into stuff that will be obsolete soon anyway. 2. Demand data transparency on leaks. This helps with planning and holds people accountable. 3. Create a regional market-based program for the energy transition, kind of like the successful regional greenhouse gas initiative for power plants. And finally, 4. Empower local action. Get rid of those state preemption laws that are just stifling innovation.
Ultimately, it really all comes down to this one core idea. Resiliency isn't something one city or one state can achieve on its own. Not anymore. In a system this interconnected, real resilience can only be achieved at the regional biome level. So, the crucial point is this. We have a choice. We can keep trying to manage this region as a collection of disconnected political pieces, which just leads to inefficiency, inequity, and vulnerability. Or we can start managing it as the single, integrated system it truly is and make sure the entire biome can thrive for the next 100 years.
And that leaves us with one final thought. This whole framework of the infrastructure biome is a really powerful tool for understanding BosWash. But what happens when we apply it somewhere else? What other deeply interconnected systems, from global supply chains to local watersheds, are we currently trying to manage in these broken, fragmented, inefficient pieces? What else are we failing to see as a whole?